say thank you and welcome you to attending our redistricting and reprecincting update for Maricopa County. So after every centennial census, jurisdictions across the nation go through an effort to redraw boundaries. And in Arizona and Maricopa County, that is no different. Today, we will be discussing some specific changes related to Justice Court precincting and voting reprecincting that the board will be considering as we approach October 1st. There's a deadline that any changes to those boundaries need to be considered by the board. And right now that's currently scheduled for the September 27th, a special meeting in front of the Board of Supervisors. So before we get started, I do want to go over some housekeeping items related to just the functionality of the Zoom meeting. So this meeting is being recorded and will be posted online at reprecincting.maricopa.vote and approximately about 1 week after this meeting. This is the first of 5 public meetings that the Board of Supervisors and the Justice Court precincts and the Elections Department will be hosting to solicit public information or input in any changes that the board is considering. We will be accepting comments. Right now, all attendees' videos are off and their ability to speak is also, they're muted, but they can provide us input or feedback as we progress through the presentation through the chat feature. And you can find that chat feature. Usually it's at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over that bottom, a little pop-up will happen and it gives you the option to select the chat. It looks like a little a bubble where you'd write comments. If you can't find it there, there's usually 3 elliptical dots that you can select that then would give you the option for a chat feature. If you are attending via phone, and we will try to answer those questions in the chat as we progress through the presentation. And if you are attending by phone and you aren't able to submit a comment or input through the chat feature, you can send an email through directly to our voter info line. So that email is VOTERINFO risk.maricopa, maricopa.gov. So that's voterinfo@risk.maricopa.gov. And we won't be able to answer your question in real time via the chat, but we will provide a response to you through the email. And then you can always submit public input through the website where you registered for this meeting. And Megan Gilbertson, our communications director, will be going through that process shortly. And I do want to thank, we have Judge Huberman and Judge Russell on the line with us from the Justice Court precincts. I'll be introducing them in a second, but I want to give a shout out and a thank you to some of our staff members that will be assisting with the presentation today. We have Selena Olivas Iglesias. She's our bilingual community outreach coordinator. Gary Bellata, director of GIS for the Recorder's Office, and Megan Gilbertson, our communications director. So they will be playing a role in the presentation today. And before we continue on with the agenda, I do want to turn it over to Selena Olivas Iglesias. She's going to be providing a brief update in Spanish for our Spanish-speaking attendees.
Bienvenidos. Gracias por asistir a las reuniones públicas de redistribución del Condado Maricopa. Después de que el censo se realiza cada 10 años, las entidades son responsables de evaluar los límites de los distritos. Entonces es cuando se debe de comenzar a distribuir sus esfuerzos a nivel federal, estatal y local. Hoy vamos a discutir cuál es el papel que juega el Condado Maricopa al rediseñar las líneas de los distritos y los recintos, y vamos a revisar los detalles de los cambios de la Junta de Supervisores que van a ser considerados para los recintos electorales y los recintos del Tribunal de Justicia. A medida que se van evaluando estos cambios propuestos, el condado ha establecido estas reuniones públicas y un sitio web público donde ustedes van a poder hacer sus preguntas, sus aportaciones, sus observaciones para tomar en cuenta todos estos comentarios y que sean considerados al momento en que se realice la redistribución de recintos. El enfoque de la reunión pública de hoy es principalmente los cambios propuestos para el recinto electoral y Tribunal de Justicia del Distrito 2 de la Junta de Supervisores. Antes de comenzar, voy a dar unos pequeños puntos importantes para la reunión. La primera es esta reunión está siendo grabada y será publicada en línea en la página redistribución.maricopa.voto. Si usted tiene algún comentario o alguna pregunta, por favor, use la función de chat Zoom, donde puede usted escribir sus comentarios o preguntas. Y nosotros le vamos a responder a lo largo de esta presentación. También puede enviar sus comentarios en línea en redistribución.maricopa.voto o enviando un correo electrónico a voterinfo@riskmaricopa.com. Repito el correo electrónico, es voterinfo@risk.maricopa.gov. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia.
Thank you, Selena. So today we will be covering a brief welcome from our judges. I'll be introducing them. Then we will be going through and discussing Maricopa County's role in the redistricting effort, and then also describing what is reprecincting, what methodologies the justice courts are using, as well as the elections department and the board are considering as they go through the reprecincting effort. We'll be going through our public website and talking about how members of the public can provide input into the reprecincting efforts. And then we'll go through and go through each individual changes in what we call these exhibits for each of the reprecincting lines or boundaries that we're considering changing. And then we'll give an opportunity for questions and answers. And this is when we'll go through and we'll talk about the chat for those that are on the phone that can hear the questions that were submitted in the chat and the responses that we'll be providing. So before we continue on to the nuts and bolts of the presentation, I do want to introduce our presiding judge, Anna Huberman. She is a justice of the peace for Country Meadows Precinct, where she has served since 2012, when the Board of Supervisors created the Country Meadows Justice Court. The Justice of the Peace in Maricopa County elected Judge Huberman to serve as the presiding judge of the peace, and her term in that term and leadership position began July 1st of this year. Prior to her election to the bench, Judge Huberman served as a court interpreter with Maricopa County Superior Court for 15 years. So Judge, before I introduce Judge Russell, do you have any comments that you want to relay to the public before we begin?
I would just like to say that thank you all for coming and thank you for your interest in this topic. I do want to make clear that the process of looking into the changes to our precincts began early this year, and it was led by our then presiding judge and then court administrator, Keith Russell and Jim Morrow. With the help of our stellar staff in court administration, who helped them evaluate the caseloads in each court and map the JPCs by voting precincts, they were able to propose the solutions that we will talk about this evening to even out the workload between the neighboring courts as much as possible. Special thanks goes out to Recorder Richard's office, who assisted us in every step of the way.
Thank you, Judge. And now for Judge Keith Russell. He is a Justice of the Peace in the East Mesa Precinct, where he has served since 2013. The Justice of the Peace in Maricopa County elected Judge Russell to serve as the presiding judge of the peace in 2017 and again in 2019. He completed his term in that leadership position in June. And prior to taking the bench, Judge Russell served as the Maricopa County Assessor, having first been elected in 2004 and then re-elected in 2008 and 2012. So Judge Russell, do you have a few comments for us?
As soon as I can get to that mute button. Thank you, Scott. I thank you all who are on the call or on the presentation. This has been an exciting process for us, as you will see in the presentation. This is something that is needed by our courts. I think that we have enjoyed a lot of support from not only the JPs in Maricopa County, but also the constables. Want to express my appreciation to all of them for the support through this process. I also need to say thank you to Chairman Sellers of the Board of Supervisors for his work and support, as well as Recorder Richer and all of his staff. They're great people to work with. This has been a very positive experience. Thank you, everybody who has participated, and we look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Huberman and Judge Russell. So now I'm going to turn it over to Megan Gilbertson, our Communications Director for the Elections Department. She's going to go through our public-facing website. Many of you use this website to register for the public meetings, but she'll talk through some of the features and functionality of the website. So, Megan, are you ready?
Yes, I am. So I am sharing the screen right now, and you can find it at reprecincting.maricopa.vote. Here you'll be able to find historic maps, including, starting all the way back to 2006, where you can load and you can see those changes to each individual district, as well as the proposed changes, which we'll cover in detail for District 2 today by clicking on the button for View the Proposed Maps. Here we provide some information about methodology, and the most important thing is this is a great place for you to provide your public comments, especially your precinct-specific comments. If you do have those, you can provide them and provide us the names so we can make those recommendations and changes. We'll show them all to the board for their consideration. We have this same information for the justice court precincts, which we'll cover today as well, where you can see those historic maps, as well as the proposed map for the justice precinct boundaries, which the judges will cover in detail today. In addition, you can provide those public comments here specifically for the justice precincts, as well as the precinct names if you have those. And lastly, this is where you can provide your information. We have information about these public meetings. You're welcome to attend other meetings beyond today. And as Scott said at the beginning of the presentation, we will be providing a link to this recorded meeting, as well as the presentation and documents here on this website for future review, should you need that. Other than that, I'm going to pass it back to Scott, who will be able to continue the presentation. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you, Megan. Going back to the presentation. And I do want to encourage you all to make use of the website that Megan just reviewed. Your input in this process is very valuable as the board considers making these changes. There's a community of interest out there that we want to make sure that we're considering those input. There are legislative district chairs, there's other folks, there's precinct committeemen, there's voters, there's the public that all have valuable input as we move forward with making these recommendations to the board, and the board would like to consider as they decide whether to approve these boundary changes or not. So now I'd like to discuss the Maricopa County's role in redistricting. And as many jurisdictions throughout our entire nation are going through, every 10 years after the census releases its count numbers, there's a lot of activity related to redistricting that is occurring. And Maricopa County plays a very important role in that process. Essentially, I describe this as we're sort of the glue that helps make sure that everything sort of happens within Maricopa County and in Arizona as well. There's lots of jurisdictions, including the Independent Redistricting Commission at the state level, to local districts that are cities and school districts and others that all need to redraw their boundaries. And without the assistance of Maricopa County, it really would not be possible. So right now, and most of you are probably aware, there is an independent redistricting commission. So this was established actually in the Constitution of Arizona. And they are tasked with redrawing the congressional district and legislative districts. So, and this is probably the one that you're most familiar with, which is our US House of Representatives. Arizona has 9 congressional districts. Actually, 8 of those overlap Maricopa County. We are currently, those are currently being considered and will be redrawn as the Independent Redistricting Commission analyzes the census data. And we're anticipating them to release some of their information to us in either late December or early January. They're also, at that same time, they're redrawing the legislative district boundaries. So that's the Arizona State Senate, as well as the Arizona House of Representatives. And there's currently 30 districts in Arizona, legislative districts in Arizona. And right now, 20 of those overlap Maricopa County. So as the Independent Redistricting Commission goes through and makes those changes, there will be a lot of information and lines and boundaries that will overlap with Maricopa County's process as we go through our redistricting. There's also other lines that are considered by the Board of Supervisors, and it's the Board of Supervisors' responsibility to review, consider, and potentially approve new lines. And that would be the Board of Supervisor lines themselves. And in Maricopa County, we also have community college lines and special healthcare district lines that track to the same lines as the Board of Supervisor lines. And that's all established in ARS 15411 or ARS 455501. And due to the delayed census data, so typically anytime a jurisdiction is going through and redrawing boundaries, the census releases its data earlier in the year, usually in January, February, March of any even year, and any odd year. And because of the pandemic, COVID-19, this was significantly delayed, and we didn't receive the data for the Board of Supervisors to be able to consider redrawing these boundaries until late August. So recognizing that challenge, the state legislature actually provided an extension in SB 1107 so that the board did not need to redraw the Board of Supervisor boundaries until and improve those until July 1, 2022. And there's another reason for that as well, because the Independent Redistricting Commission, they're going through and redrawing those lines. And right now you can't have a board line overlap more than one legislative district or congressional district. So the county will have to go through and incorporate those new lines produced and redrawn by the Independent Redistricting Commission. And the county won't receive that information until either late December, or early January. And then the board can then consider that as they redraw those Board of Supervisor district lines in next spring, and then get those approved before July 1. But as I mentioned earlier, there's many other districts that are going through the same redistricting effort. In Maricopa County, we have 6 cities and towns that will be redrawing those boundaries. Those include the cities of Buckeye, town of Buckeye, cities of Surprise, Peoria, Phoenix, Glendale, and then Mesa. And then we have 3 schools. One is the Phoenix Union School District. And then we have the East Valley Institute of Technology and the West MEC districts that will also be redrawing those lines. Other boundaries include the voting precincts as well as the justice court precincts, which is why we're here today to discuss those. And all of these will need to be updated by October 1st. So with that, we're going to go through and talk specifically about the methodologies that the justice court precincts considered as they updated their boundaries. So I'm going to turn it over to Judge Huberman to discuss this methodology.
Thank you. Thank you again. I want to begin by saying that we have 26 justice courts in Maricopa County. 25 of those are full-time courts, and then we have Ironwood Justice Court, which is a part-time court. Our judges and administrators have been aware for some time now that there have been issues with the current precinct lines that have created an imbalance in the workload among the courts. As I said before, Judge Russell and our past administrator, Jim Morrow, put a lot of time and effort into this project. They worked closely with the presiding constable, Mike Branham, and obviously couldn't have done any of this without our staff in court administration. And they came up with a plan. They made regional presentations of their suggestions. They had individual conversation with judges and constables. They ran and reran numbers as suggestions were proposed. So by the time that I was elected presider, most of the decisions and agreements were already in place. Myself and our new court administrator, Chris Reams, are extremely grateful for their dedication and the hard work on the project. As you will hear in the recorder's portion this evening, the basis in determining voting precinct lines is population. But for justice court precincts, it's JPCs, judicial productivity credits. So we should start by explaining what judicial productivity credits are. So justice courts hear 7 types of cases. Those different cases generate different amounts of work according to the case type, both for the judge and for the staff, depending on many factors. And the case types vary from court to court based on geography and boundaries. Some courts may have more seasonal work because they have lakes or rivers. Some courts may have more freeways, which create more criminal traffic cases. Some courts have more apartment complexes, which translates into more evictions. Although there could be different metrics to measure work in the justice courts, the legislature has settled on JPCs. JPCs assign a value to each case type filed in each court. Those values are legislated in statute, and that would be ARS 22-125. This statute also provides that judicial salaries are determined by the total judicial productivity credits. But what interests us here today is subsection H, which establishes that justice court precincts shall not exceed 1,200 JPCs. If it does, the County Board of Supervisors shall create sufficient courts, meaning that they could add a new court or redraw the precinct lines, which is our proposal today. Next slide. As you will see, the workload across the different courts in the county is very imbalanced. We have 2 courts that currently exceed those 1,200 JPCs described in statute. Although constables are elected in the same precincts as the justice of the peace, the constable workload is not driven by JPCs and may be difficult to measure. Constable work is higher in precincts with high evictions, such as Country Meadows and Manistee. Among other things, constables serve orders of protection on defendants that reside in the constable's precinct, regardless of which judge issued the order. Next slide. Taking into account the total workload in the county, a perfect balance would be 900 JPCs per court. In this graph, the green section shows the courts that are currently between 800 and 1,000 JPCs. As you can see, we currently have 9 courts in the low range of JPCs, 2 of those under 700. 7 courts are in the high range, 2 of those over 1,200. I will now turn it over to Judge Keith Russell.
Thank you, Judge Huberman. As Judge Huberman was talking about, we've got 26 justice courts. You can see those on this map of the county, as well as the 5 districts for the Board of Supervisors. Today's meeting focuses on Supervisory District 2, which is located up in the northeast part of the county, or the upper right section of this map. We have a total of 7 justice courts that are partly or completely in Supervisory District number 2. That includes the Desert Ridge, the McDowell Mountain, the 3 Mesa Justice Courts, North Mesa, West Mesa, and East Mesa, as well as the Highland Court and the Santan Court. Changes are proposed to all of these courts except for West Mesa, but the changes to most of these courts are minor. If we could jump back to the, there you go, the countywide one in between, wonderful. The other thing about this map is you will notice the dotted areas, if you can see them on your screen, and the more vibrant colors. These denote areas that are changing or proposed to being changed. And we're only really going to talk about the ones that are encompassed in District 2 today. So in the upper part of the map, you will see a paler, maybe a darker pink area. Desert Ridge is up there. The Desert Ridge Court actually goes across a couple of supervisory districts, and all of the changes in this court are actually in Supervisory District 3, which we're going to be talking or doing a presentation on Thursday. But just to give you a little sense, there's some changes with the court immediately to the west, or the North Valley Court. These net a difference in JPCs of less than 20 based upon historical numbers, so it's not a substantial change. But again, all of these changes take place in Supervisory District 3. The light or blue area is the McDowell Mountain Justice Court. It's south and east from the Desert Ridge Court. McDowell Mountain has the lowest number of JPCs for any of our full-time justice courts. And the changes in this court are located in its southern area. If you look on the map, you'll see a darker blue area that has dotted lines. That darker area is proposed to be going into McDowell Mountain. It's coming from the Arcadia Biltmore Court. There's a combination of 2 moves with Arcadia Biltmore and McDowell Mountain, but the net result of those moves are an increase to McDowell Mountain of approximately 127 JPCs based upon historical numbers. Moving a little farther south, you'll see some brighter, darker green areas. Those areas are proposed changes to the lighter green area, which is known as the Highland Court. The ones at the top of the Highland precinct are coming from North Mesa, and that rectangular box up below the bigger area is coming from the San Marcos Justice Court. The Highland Court is the second lowest number of total JPCs for a full-time court in our collection. The net result of these changes, including an adjustment I'm going to talk about in a minute, accounts for a little over 100 additional JPCs coming into Highland. If you look a little bit below and to the right of the darker green areas, you'll see 2 bright red areas. Those are areas that are going from the Highland Court to the Santan Court. This is mostly to help with the configuration of boundary lines and only changes approximately 14 JPCs based upon historic numbers. And our last change is a little bit above, but farther to the right. The orange area denotes an area that's going from East Mesa, which is also in blue, to North Mesa, and helps with the configuration of the boundary lines, and only accounts for approximately 13 JPCs based upon what has historically our historic numbers. Let me encourage you to remember that at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about maps that you could go to on the elections website. I think they're going to show more detail. We have, and let's go to our next map if we could. This just shows the supervisory district number 2. The double red line shows the boundaries for supervisory district number 2. The white lines that you see on the map denote voting precincts. It gives you a sense of how voting precincts also can be different in size. There's currently a little less than 750 voting precincts, I believe. There's a total of 44 voting precincts that are changing because of our court realignment of our boundaries, are a little bit under 6% of the total. In Supervisory District 2, we have almost half of them. Therefore, the list is so long, it would be difficult to go through. But again, I think on the website, you're going to be able to get information, or in the chat, you can ask questions if you have it about any particular voting precinct as it exists today. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So we gave you basically the answer to the question or the problem, almost like a Jeopardy question. But now we're going to talk about the process that we utilize to come up with these proposed changes. The solution for adjusting boundary lines is also found in the statute. It's ARS 22-101A. It basically empowers the Board of Supervisors to adjust those boundary lines to change or abolish different justice courts. We are grateful again for the work that we've been able to do with the Board of Supervisors on this. If you go to the next slide, thank you. This slide talks about the model that we used to measure the proposed changes that we're proposing. COVID has been challenging in many areas. One of them is collecting good caseload data from the justice courts. Because of COVID, we've had a number of case types that have seen a decrease from where we have been historically. Those would include case types like evictions or traffic citations. However, we expect that those case numbers will go back to pre-pandemic levels once we get through the pandemic and the impact of it. The last full calendar year that we had to work with that was pre-pandemic was 2019. So all of the numbers we're quoting are based upon 2019 statistics. We absolutely recognize Maricopa County continues to grow, but the relationship with those statistics from a few years ago, we believe continues to hold as a good measure of what to expect moving forward. If we could go to the next slide. So basically our goal was to help the courts with the highest caseloads or workloads and those with the lowest. That was the primary focus. We recognize that there may be an opportunity for some additional minor adjustments. Some of the ones that we talked about reflect that, where there was very little change in workload, but there were other reasons such as access to a court, et cetera, that could make a difference with how those boundary lines were drawn. With that, let me turn it back over to Judge Huberman.
Thank you, Judge Russell. All right, so to achieve these goals, we had to consider certain parameters. We had to draw our lines along voting precinct lines. Voting precincts cannot be split into more than one justice court precinct. The second part of today's presentations deals with the changes to the voting precinct lines. So some of our lines will change in accordance to the changes being proposed by the Recorder's Office. Most of our courts reside in co-located facilities, so the court building itself cannot be in each individual court's precincts, but it should be in the precinct of one of the courts in the building preferably centrally located. For the standalone courts that don't share a building, it was important to make sure the location of the courthouse remained in the precinct, as well as the home of both elected officials, so they weren't drawn out of their precinct. Next slide. Once we identified the courts with the highest and lowest JPCs, we looked at the adjoining precincts where adjustments could be made. The objective was to find an equitable solution for all the courts and elected officials involved to try to get the courts between 800 to 1,000 JPCs. Once again, I must commend Judge Russell and Constable Branham in working with all of the elected officials to come up with a solution that everyone could agree with. And I would also like to thank the judges and constables who agreed to add precincts, adding to their caseload to allow the highest JPC courts relief. I just want to be very clear that the proposal that we are making is a proposal that has been agreed upon by all 26 courts and all 26 constables. So that, again, is a major accomplishment. Next slide. Our statistician was able to break up the JPC data down to the voting precinct level. This allowed us to look for the most obvious boundary adjustments between higher and lower JPCs adjoining precincts. We tried to minimize complex adjustments involving more than 2 courts. And if the more obvious or simple adjustments were not viable, we still tried to employ common sense in the moves. We were very fortunate to be able to keep the boundary line adjustments to adjoining precincts in all but one situation. For example, even though our 2 highest JPC courts, Country Meadows and Manistee, share a boundary, we were able to adjust their boundary lines with other adjoining courts whose JPCs were at the lower end of the spectrum. The one more complicated move was adjusting McDowell Mountain upward, which is what Judge Russell mentioned before. We did not have an obvious choice to move from an adjoining precinct. So we needed to move some area from the downtown Justice Court to the Arcadia Biltmore Justice Court. So then Arcadia Biltmore could move another area to McDowell Mountain. Again, we express our appreciation to the 3 courts involved with this move. As you can imagine, a 3-way move is considerably more complicated than a 2-way move. The downtown Justice Court precinct is located just where it sounds like, downtown. The Arcadia Biltmore precinct is located to the north and east of downtown, and then the McDowell Mountain precinct is in East Phoenix and runs northeast to the McDowell Mountain area. In a manner of speaking, this 3-way move allowed JPCs from downtown to be moved into McDowell Mountain. Next slide. Here you can see what the expected balance will look like. As you can see, except for a few exceptions, all courts will fall between the 800 and 1,000 JPC range, which was our goal. Ironwood is our part-time court, which is why their JPCs are so much lower. After this plan was finalized and agreed to, we realized that some of the changes proposed by the Elections Department to voting precincts would affect some of our numbers. Most of the changes are minimal and shouldn't have a huge impact on any court, but the final numbers might be a little different from this chart. And with that, if there are no further questions, I will turn it back to Scott Jarrett from the Election Department.
So Megan, do we have any questions for the Justice Court precincts?
No, we have not received any, but if there are some moving forward, please put them in the chat and we'll be sure to answer them either in the chat or bring them back for the judges to answer.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Judge Huberman and Judge Russell. So now we'll be talking about voting precincts and some of our goals for making changes and updating the voting precincts. Well, first off, talk about the importance of a voting precinct. And essentially the voting precinct is the building blocks or the foundation for any election. And what we found is in the elections department is the voting precincts really help us guide to have a smooth in-person voting experience. Most of our systems are built off of using voting precincts to help guide when where we send sample ballots. We use this for ballot building processes. They help us determine, based on all the other districts that are overlapping within or next to and include a voting precinct, helps us determine what would be on a particular voter's ballot. And then they're also one of the smallest components of how we report results. And then the political parties and the public and the media and many folks will use those data to analyze the results and identify which precinct and how the voting patterns within those precincts themselves. So some of the goals and priorities that we set out to do is, well, first off, we wanted to be very transparent in our changes, and we wanted to minimize and only the number of changes and only make those changes when they were absolutely necessary or essential. So as we've discussed, Maricopa County has gone through significant growth over the last 10 years. The 2020 census found that Maricopa County grew by over 603,000 residents. And then those out of, I think there are 740,000 total in the state of Arizona. So that means that in Maricopa County, we made up nearly 80% of the total growth within Arizona. So we need to make changes to accommodate population growth. And we identify that as usually to keep voting precincts less than 5,000 active voters or less than 2,000 non-active early voters. It used to be called the permanent early voting list. Now it's moved to the active early voting list. So we wanted to create sufficient precincts that to provide and support that smooth in-person voting option. We also wanted to make sure that none of our voting precincts were cutting through any homes, apartment complexes, or other buildings. Since 2018, with the significant amount of growth that occurred in Maricopa County, those lines in 2018 did have some instances where that was occurring. And then we wanted to make sure that those lines would align with any changes that the Justice Court precincts were considering. So they can make sure and even out that workload balance of those Justice Court productivity credits. So voting precinct by the numbers. So the last time we updated voting precincts in Maricopa County was 2018. Prior to that, it was actually 2012. You can go to our website. You can see those prior maps on the website and how they were drawn. We're currently considering total countywide 133 changes. 73 of those have to do directly with growth. 32 of those changes have to do with a precinct boundary or line cutting through a home or a building. And then 40 of those are to align the precincts with Justice Court precincts. Now that does not add to a total of 133. There's actually 12 changes in there that are a combination of multiple factors above. So if you went through and added 73, 32, and 40, you'd get slightly more than 133. So what this would mean for the voting precincts in Maricopa County is would actually increase the number at 86 and go from 748 to 834 total precincts. And why the Board of Supervisors, if they approve these changes by October 1st, they would not be effective until January 2nd, 2022. So now we're going to talk about the methodology of a few of those reasons why we're changing. So this is actually a change that is occurring in the Southeast Valley near Queen Creek. And we could see that, and this is related to precincts that exceed 5,000 voters. So when you look at this slide, on the left-hand side is the current voting precincts that were implemented in 2018. And on the right-hand side is the draft precincts that we're considering changing. And here you have Adora and Brooks Farm that have had significant population growth. And to accommodate that population growth, we're going through and recommending that the board consider they divide this precinct up actually into 4 different precincts: the Weinberg precinct, the Brooks Farm precinct, and the Dora precinct, and the Constellation precinct. So this is a good example of an area in the valley, far southeast valley. It's going through tremendous population growth. The next is an example of voting precincts that are cutting through some homes. So if you see the precinct that we're talking about here is the Falcon Hill precinct. It's the precinct there in the middle. Again, the left-hand side image shows the current precincts, and there is a road, a main thoroughfare there, McKellips Road, that cuts north of that precinct. However, the current boundary just goes right south of McKellips Road. Well, that results in it cutting through a few homes that are south of that road. So what we'd be proposing to the Board of Supervisors is to move that boundary up to follow McKellips Road. What happens here is it does cause some confusion for the voters when those voting precincts split a home, as it does in this situation. And the next is a situation where we are moving the boundary to align with a Justice Court precinct change. So here we're talking about the Ironwood Justice Court, and this is actually in District 4, the far west valley, and moving the Iron Justice Court precinct and the White Tinks Justice Court precinct further to the east. So in the current boundary, which is on the left, it's following through, what is that, 355th Avenue, and we're moving that boundary just about a mile to the east to help the Justice Court precincts align those justice productivity credits between those 2 courts. So this is an example of that third situation. And before we get into each of the exhibits that are specific to District 2 changes, just wanted to provide you a county-wide map, and this map is actually available on our website. And it shows where most of the changes of those 133 changes are occurring. And as you can see, the vast majority are occurring in the far southeast portion of the valley, as well as the far west portion of the valley. And the vast majority of those are attributed to voter growth, our population growth, and then the increase in the number of registered voters. The ones that are in the Central Valley, which would include portions of District 3 and the east side of District 4, are primarily due to the Justice Court precinct changes and those modifications. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the exhibits. Megan, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Angela, and Charlie from the Justice Courts answered it, but I'm going to give it right here for everyone to hear in case they're on the phone. Angela asked if the West Mesa, which is in the Salt River Pima Indian community, if they have the highest caseload. And Charlie said that the West Mesa currently has the 3rd highest caseload, and under the proposed change to the justice precincts, West Mesa will have the highest caseload as the number 1 and number 2 highest caseload courts. And then we have another question for you, Scott. And this question is from Nancy, and she was wondering if the county will be choosing to use precinct-based voting or vote centers in 2022.
So currently, the plan that we're submitting right now is just to redraw the precinct-based boundaries. And one of the advantages of this approach right now, besides us having to meet the statutory deadline of October 1st, is it provides the board the flexibility for multiple options. So when we implemented our vote center model in the 2020 cycle, that was out of a response to address situations and overcome the challenges of COVID-19. And we had rave reviews from poll workers, from voters, from members of the public about the ability to use a vote center and vote anywhere model. But the board will be evaluating that feedback that we received from the community as they move forward with approving the voting plans for 2022, which will occur in the spring of 2022. So at this point in time, that decision has not been finalized. So.
And the last question we had was from Kathy. She was asking about the dotted line areas, the orange dotted line areas. Will they be in the North Valley or Desert Ridge area? And Charlie said that the orange dotted lines, those are highlighted voting precincts being proposed to shift from one justice precinct to another.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So I'm going to go to the individual exhibits. And I'm actually at the same time going to introduce Gary Bellata. He's our Director of GIS, or Geographical Information Systems. And he's going to join me as we go through each of the 21 total changes that we will have or are recommending the board consider for District 2. And how those break down is in District 1, there are 6 changes resulted directly from a current boundary or a voting precinct boundary cutting through a home. There are 7 that are to align that voting precinct with a justice court precinct change. And then there are 11 related to population growth. So now we're going to go through each of these exhibits. Gary, are you on the line?
I am here. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, great. So the first change that we'll be discussing is the Barnes voting precinct. And this one is, again, another situation where we have a voting precinct that was cutting through a few buildings. This one actually doesn't impact any voters. It was just slightly west. So if you see the left image here, that's the current boundaries. The right image is the proposed change. And here it's very difficult to even see the change. This line was slightly west of the main road there on 61st Street. Is that right, Gary? And it was cutting through the back end of a few buildings there. We just moved it to align with the main road.
Perfect, Scott. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing.
So the next change is for the Calypso precinct, and this is to align that boundary with the East Mesa Justice Court and the Santan Justice Court. And really the change is occurring there on the north end of the Calypso boundary. As you follow Broadway Road, you see a couple notches in the old boundary, which is on the left, that are going into the boundary just north of that into Hawes precinct. And we're aligning that just to follow Broadway Road. Very few voters are impacted here. We have the total voters prior to this change at 3,106, and now it's modifying that to 3,098. Any other changes you want to cover here, Gary?
No, that's the change just on Broadway Road, just those little blips that go to the north, just straighten that out to make it very clear on where those boundaries are.
All right, so the next change is for the Dallas voting precinct. This is again one to align a boundary with the East Mesa Justice Court and the Santan Justice Court changes. And the primary changes here are all occurring on the west side of that boundary in the Dallas precinct. It's just to follow that Ellsworth Road change. And there's a few notches there towards the west side of that boundary that they're just aligning that with the main thoroughfare there. Any other changes?
You described it perfectly, Scott. That's exactly it.
So the next change, this is the first one we're discussing that's related to voter totals. And this is for the DC Ranch. So in DC Ranch, in the 2018 our precinct, there was actually 7,565. And if you remember back, our Our methodology is to have fewer than 5,000 total voters in a precinct. So this is about 2,500 more than what our current top of the line number. And when we redraw this precinct, we're actually creating a new precinct. Right now, we just have a proposed name, Legacy precinct here, but that name may end up changing. And then we also have then the DC Legacy or precinct that's just south of that, the current precinct name. And when we split that out, Legacy actually will have 2,958 voters in it. And the DC Ranch would then fall to under 5,000, 4,631 total voters. So any other changes there, Gary, that you'd like to point out?
Those are the main changes, but I did want to point out, a lot of times voting precincts, we can't draw them perfect. We mentioned in the beginning here, there were 7,500 voters. If we could get perfectly and split that into two, that would be great. But, due to how streets are built and subdivisions are put in, sometimes it cannot be an exact division. And so, one of the DC Ranch, the resulting DC Ranch voting precinct is a little on the, approaching 5,000 voters still, but and Legacy is a little bit lower. But, the line we drew down Legacy, I think it's Legacy Boulevard, is a main thoroughfare, and it's a very clear division between the two voting precincts going forward. So there's, reduces any kind of voter confusion and things like that.
And other factors the GIS team considers as they're redrawing these include other geographic barriers, could be canals, could be mountains, definitely major thoroughfares such as roads, or whether this precinct aligns with the current school district boundary, a city or town boundary. Any of those other factors are also considerations as they make these proposed changes. So the next change is for the Desert Haven voting precinct. And this is related to population growth as well. So the primary change, if you could see there on the left side, is we had Desert Haven precinct. This is in the far southeast valley, and it was following it did not follow the Signal Butte Road. It was much further east than that, and we're really splitting that in half and having Eastmark come over a little bit further east. And so what that does for the voting numbers is for Desert Haven, it was at 5,930 total voters, and this reduces it to 3,935 total voters.
And what I'd like to say for this one, Scott, is, Desert Haven, even though it's not greatly above the 5,000 mark, the voting precincts adjacent to it are greatly above that 5,000 mark. And so being able to shrink that and to be able to kind of recalculate the voting precincts in the area really helped out by shrinking that Desert Haven to align it to Signal Butte Road, and then, adjusting the Eastmark and the Parkwood and some of those other ones around it. So this is in the Eastmark area on the far east area of the valley, where there's just amazing growth going on here. And so it's a very large change. And we're also proposing new voting precincts, further down as we get through the presentation.
And then actually the next precinct we're discussing is Eastmark. So the one just to the east. And so you can see the line there on the left. Now the new changes in the image on the right. And so Eastmark was at 2,975 voters previously. Because we were able to make that accommodation and reduce the number of precincts in some of the surrounding precincts, this actually increases to 3,531. And we're also then splitting the Eastmark precinct with the Cadence precinct. And it goes from now the Cadence precinct is now going to Carmel with 3,249 total voters here. So Gary, this is probably one of the more complex changes that you had to make. It is
quite complex. Yeah, the Eastmark voting precinct, if you look on the left side, was cutting through quite a few homes. When that line was drawn, there was no homes there, and there was no subdivisions even proposed yet that we could draw a line to not cut through those homes. And so if you look on the right side, it's kind of completely reformatted. The Cadence voting precinct is a new voting precinct. And we are following a major road and some lot lines up on the north side of that Cadence. There's some lot lines and another, what we think is going to be a major road, because that's still all growing, the north end of Cadence and Parkwood. And so, we did our best to try to figure out where streets will go in, or there'll be boundaries to follow in the future. So we don't come into another situation like on the left side where it was cutting through homes.
Thanks, Gary. So the next precinct is the Escondido precinct. This again is a change directly related to population growth and increase in voter registration numbers. So in the current boundary, the one on the left, Escondido had over 7,497 total voters in that precinct. And by being able to adjust this one and create a new precinct, Carmel, this is where we're able to actually split that into, Carmel has 3,249 voters, and the new version of Escondido would drop to 4,259 total voters. And this is also on the East Valley. This is along Loop 202 and the US 60.
And I also do want to mention one other thing on this map, Scott, and it kind of pertains to the map previous this as well. You can see in Carmel, there's an area with out streets. And so some of these voting precincts we draw to have, 2,000 or 2,500 voters, because we know they're going to fill in over time. So I just wanted, there's room for growth here in that Carmel voting precinct and the ones that we were talking about on the previous exhibit.
That's a good point. Thanks, Gary. So the next precinct change is for Falcon Hill, and this is to accommodate a line that our current precinct line that was cutting through homes, and then also for the Justice Court precinct changes as well. And this was actually the example we used early on in what we described our methodology. So in that Falcon Hill precinct on McKellips Road, this is where the prior line was cutting through a few homes. By being able to follow that main thoroughfare of McKellips Road, we resolved that issue of any of the precincts cutting through those voters' homes. Are there any other changes to this precinct, Gary?
And then we covered it when we covered the Dallas voting precinct, but on the east side, we're going along Ellsworth to also align the Justice precinct along with Dallas there on the east side.
Oh, there towards the east side down.
Yeah. And we talked a bit about that when we were on the Dallas exhibit.
So the next precinct change is for the Hawes precinct, and this is to align with the precinct boundaries with the Justice Court precinct boundaries. And the primary change here is there towards the southwest portion of this precinct. And we have those two notches that are in that basically cutting from the Calypso precinct into Hawes in the prior 2018 version of the precincts. And we flattened those out to just align with the Broadway Road in the new versions of the precincts that will be considered.
And also, Scott, on the east side, the southeast side, there's a Weir precinct, W-I-E-R, where we're doing the same thing where it kind of cuts south, but we're aligning the entire thing to Broadway there. I don't know if you caught that there. See on the east side of the 202.
Yeah.
Right. So we're straightening that out along Broadway.
This does impact only a couple hundred voters. Halls did have 3,644 total voters prior to this recommended change. Now it will have 3,249. So the next change is for the Hermosa Vista voting precinct change. And this is, again, another situation where it was cutting through homes. And this is actually the exact opposite. It's the Falcon Hill we had already discussed. And anytime that you have a voting precinct that's cutting through homes and you make a modification, there's going to be that same change to another precinct. So this is just the Hermosa Hermosa Vista precinct, which is on the north side of McKellips Road. And by aligning the old precinct to follow the McKellips Road, it cuts a little bit into that Hermosa Vista. So the next precinct is the Highland precinct, and this is specifically to address population growth and increases in voter registration. So prior to, or in the 2018 version of these precincts, we had about 6,887 total voters in Highland. And by splitting this and creating a new precinct, the Blackbird precinct, we're able to take Highland down from 3,551, or from 6,887 to 3,551 total voters. And then the Blackbird precinct, which is there on the northeast side of the precinct, that will have 3,347 total voters. Is there any other changes here, Gary?
No, that's a perfect description, Scott. And also there's room for growth with those numbers in both of these voting precincts. So. And there's definitely some space available.
Yeah, they're towards the east side of both of the precincts.
Yeah.
So the next precinct that we'll discuss is the Calypso precinct. And this is another situation where the current boundary that was drawn in 2018 is currently cutting through homes. And you can see by the little circle there, towards the east or south portion of the Calypso precinct. We're just moving that slightly. Do you remember, Gary, what direction we're moving that?
Yeah, we're just moving it to the east, maybe 50 feet to get to the center line of that road. It was just barely clipping a couple homes, or really the edge of homes, just to make it very clear that it should be going along the roadway.
And there's actually no voters that are impacted by this change.
That's correct, yes.
So the next precinct is the Kiva precinct, and Kiva's around Scottsdale Road in Chaparral. And so we're making this change to accommodate or align the boundary with a Justice Court precinct change. And this is primarily down in the southwest portion of the Kiva precinct, and where there was a funny little notch there. And we're just aligning it with Chaparral Road.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Exactly how you describe that, to align to Chaparral Road there. So there's not that kind of odd notch.
And the next precinct we'll be covering is the Lone Mountain voting precinct. And this is to address population growth and the total number of registered voters. So in 2018, Lone Mountain precinct had 7,650 total voters. And we're creating a new precinct, the Black Mountain precinct. So splitting it essentially in half towards the north portion of the precinct. And so that would reduce Lone Mountain's total number of voters to 3,733. So almost a 4,000 voter decrease. And then Black Mountain would have 3,929 total voters. Are there any other changes, Gary?
That's all, Scott. And having it go down Lone Mountain Road is a very clean cut between the two.
So the next change is for the Lookout Ridge voting precinct, and this is to align the voting precinct with the Justice Court precinct changes. And this is, again, just to move that boundary up on the east side, sort of right there in the middle of the precinct, up to Chaparral Road. So very few voters impacted. Any other changes to the Lookout Ridge?
That was the only change there, Scott, just that to align to Chaparral Road. Yeah.
And then for the Oasis precinct, this is to also accommodate voter growth or population growth. And for Oasis, in the 2018 boundaries, we had over 7,000, so 7,017 total voters. And we're creating a new precinct, the Medina, recommending a new precinct, the Medina So really splitting that precinct along the US 60. So Oasis would go to the north portion of the boundary. Medina would then split down to the bottom. And so currently then that would allow for new population growth. The Oasis precinct under these new revised lines would be 2,920 total voters, and the Medina precinct would have to be 4,088 total voters.
Yeah, that's a perfect description there, Scott.
Thanks, Gary. So the next precinct is the oval voting precinct. And this is also to accommodate increases in population growth and number of voters within the precinct. So for oval, we had in the 2018 boundaries, we had 5,102, but you can see this is an area for high growth. And so we wanted to make those accommodations now. And so what we did was create a new precinct, the Cali precinct. It's up in the north side, sort of in the center of the precinct, which is right here. So the Crowley precinct, that would then take 2,127 of those voters. And then the oval precinct would then be split or down to 1,909. So that's almost a 3,000 reduction in the number of voters there. There seems, and we also created a topaz precinct right here.
Yeah, that's correct, Scott. Yeah, with the huge amount of growth here, topaz, we also created. Now the Crowley, I think you mentioned there's like 2,100 and so many voters in it. The Crowley precinct, all those streets are in there, but it is not completely built out yet. It's in the process of, there's tons of houses still being built in that area. So that's going to increase, over the next year or so as they finish out those subdivisions. And then the topaz, it's also being built out as we speak. And then I foresee the oval one being split even more in the future. But we just don't know how they're going to draw those streets and those subdivision lines. So, we left it quite open in the south end there and just waiting for the city and the developers to build that out to figure out how we need to split that up in the future. And so we'll just wait on that.
So in oval, we had 5,102. It's now reduced down to 1,909. Topaz would be 1,123 total voters. And then Crowley would be 2,127. So all of those would then be able to accommodate quite a bit of future growth. So the next change that we're recommending is in the Parkwood voting precinct. And this is to accommodate, it's cutting through homes, as I think we already reviewed a portion of this, as well as lots of voter growth. So the Parkwood precinct used to cover and really run along the Warner Road and then north of Eastmark through that entire voting precinct. Now we're splitting it. And what's that road there? Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit.
Let's see, there's Signal Butte on the east side where we're splitting Meridian off. I think that's the road you're looking for, or possibly Eastmark Parkway is the one that's kind of going on an angle, if that's the one you're looking for. That's Eastmark.
Yeah.
There.
So they're on the west side, following the Eastmark Parkway, and then, as you were saying, Gary, on the west side, following the Eastmark Parkway, and then on the east side, following Signal Butte. So then this would take Parkwood which had just over 5,000 voters with lots of opportunity for growth. So 5,068, reduce it to 1,966 total voters. Meridian, which is split there, would now have 3,647 voters. I don't know if that has a lot of opportunity for growth. It looks like most of the streets are at least filled in.
Most of the streets are filled in. Not all the homes are built in here, but most of them are. Unlike when we talked about the Crowley, the street, if you look on the south end of that map, the Crowley precinct, all the streets are in, but most of the homes have not been built in that precinct yet.
And then the Cadence would have 960 total voters. So we're basically creating two new precincts, Meridian and Cadence, to take an account for future growth.
Yes.
So the next is Pinnacle Peak. precinct. Back up a little bit. A little bit of delay here. And this is also to accommodate for population growth. So Pinnacle Peak is currently at 7,411 total voters. And we're creating actually a new precinct, Crescent Moon, which would follow there north of Pinnacle Peak along Joe Max Road. And so what this would do is take Pinnacle Peak from 7,411 total voters to 3,766. And then Crescent Moon, which is the new precinct created out of this, would have 3,686 total voters. Are there any other changes? I'm not seeing any.
You got them all on that one, Scott. That's perfect.
Okay, so we have two more to cover within District 2. Parkwood precinct, which we already covered a few of, or sorry, Portobello precinct, which is next and near Parkwood and Cadence, where we were discussing a few exhibits back. This is also to accommodate voter growth. So the Portobello precinct basically follows Loop 202. They're just to the east of Loop 202, and then follows Baseline Road and then south of the US 60 in the 2018 boundaries for the voting precincts. And what's happening with the proposed changes for Portobello is to create a new precinct, Noble precinct, which would run between Baseline and US 60. So this would take Portobello's total voters from 5,401 to 2,961. And then Noble would then have 2,473. And then this provides a lot of room for growth in both of those precincts. Any other changes, Gary?
Those were perfect, perfect descriptions there, Scott.
And then the last precinct change that we'll be recommending to the board is for the Weir precinct. And this is to accommodate or align these precincts with Justice Court precinct changes. And this would be for the East Mesa Justice Court and the Santan Justice Court. It's really to align this precinct with the Broadway Road precinct. So if you could see, there's a split in the 2018 version of the precincts that goes south of Broadway Road. It's toward the east side of the precinct. It's just to move that up north and to straighten it out. And I don't see, let's see, there's actually very few voters that are impacted for the Weir precinct. It was at 2,194, now it's increasing to 2,591. So are there any other changes that I missed here, Gary?
Got them all there, Scott. Yeah, that's perfect.
So that was the final out of the 21 total exhibits or changes that we're recommending for Supervisor District 2. That was the last one. Megan, do we have any questions that came up as we went through those exhibits?
No, we didn't have any other questions, Scott.
Okay, well, we were able to complete that with, I guess, 9 minutes to spare. Judge Uberman, Judge Russell, were there any comments or closing remarks that you'd like to make?
I just want to say thank you that what you just went through, Scott, shows the level of detail that goes into making these kind of decisions. It is a difficult process, and we want to express our appreciation to you and your staff for the work that you have done. I have been, while you have been talking, reviewing some of the other maps that you have on your website. Let me encourage people, if they want to, that is such a wonderful resource. It really does provide a lot of information. You can zoom in and out on those maps. They really are a tremendous resource. Thank you for them.
Well, thank you, Judge Russell. And right now, these specific exhibits are not posted there, but we will be posting them on the website, as well as the list of the voting precincts with the current number of registered voters in each of them. That would be countywide. So that will be another resource that will be available for the voters and for any of the public that wants to review this in much more detail. I really appreciate our attendees for listening in to get a better understanding of what Maricopa County's role is in redistricting and specifically getting into much more detail about the voting precinct changes and the justice court precinct changes that we will be recommending to the Board of Supervisors. They will be considering for approval. Again, that meeting will be a special meeting and it's currently scheduled for September 27th, 2021. So I want to thank you for your attendance. And with that, unless there's more questions, I think we can go ahead and sign off.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.